Hello to you all. Hello to you all. I'd like to introduce you to Tom Tervoort, a former colleague of mine at Medicine Work and now Secura, and he's doing security consultancy over there. And he is also a PhD in the field of medical security at AMC in Amsterdam. And he is going to talk about TLS 2.0, well 1.3, but it should have been called 2.0. And without further ado, Tom.
Yes. Thank you very much for the introduction, Guido. Now I don't have to introduce myself anymore. Can you all hear me properly? Okay. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the TLS 1.3 protocol, or TLS 2.0, or TLS 6, however you want to number them, which is going to be a pretty radical overhaul of the TLS or SSL protocol that we have been using for about 20 years by now. And I'm going to go into a bit of the rationale behind the changes in the new protocol by looking at the things that happened in the past. So first I'm going to give an introduction to how TLS works. I'm not going to dive too deep into the cryptographic details, but give an overview of the functioning of the protocol. Then I'm going to look at some of the problems that occurred in the past and the vulnerabilities that were found. I'm not going to cover every single TLS vulnerability, but some of the important ones. And then I'm going to talk about, well, what's new, how the new protocol is redesigned and how it addresses these problems. And then finally I'm going to talk about some of the issues that have not yet been solved, the more harder problems that we'll still have to deal with in the future, even with this new protocol. So, TLS. This is a picture of Amazon.com in 1994, and in the early 90s, just after the World Wide Web has been introduced, people all, quickly started thinking, hey, can we use this new thing to sell things to people? There was about around 1993, 1994, the first web shops started to appear, but this created a bit of a problem. Because when you want to do online shopping, but you don't want people to have to print out a mail order form or something like that, especially in the United States, people would have to submit credit card numbers online using forms on the web. But this created the problem that the internet could be seen as an untrusted network. Whenever you send a message through a website, it can be seen by ISPs, it could be inspected by local attackers. So people were a bit wary about having people transmit credit card numbers back and forth over the internet. And there were also some legislative issues with that as well. So early in the 90s, people started calling for, we need to do something about this problem. How can we do secure shopping online? And of course, there's also a lot of other applications that could also benefit from transmitting sensitive information over the internet. So the idea that arose was to design a protocol that would use cryptography to set up a so-called secure channel between two different communication parties. So for example, a client, someone using a web browser, and any web server, for example. Or two different mail servers, or basically any situation where two systems would set up a connection with each other. Cryptography could be used to protect this connection. And protection can mean multiple things. In this context, you want to protect against people that can sniff the network traffic, that can see what messages go back and forth, but also against people who want to spoof the identity of one of the two communication partners, or who want to temper parts of the message so it says something else, replay existing messages they saw before, or just simply changing their order, and similar kinds of attacks. So that of course creates a problem where you need to have a method for these two parties who engage in this cryptographic protocol to identify each other. I mean, you can set up a completely secure, cryptographically protected connection with someone, but if you don't know who you're talking to, it may just be an attacker performing a man-in-the-middle attack. and you're having a secure connection with an attacker. The attacker is having a secure connection to the one you're actually wanting to talk to, but the attacker can still see everything because you're securely connected to the attacker. So in order to be able to give someone the ability to prove who they are, they would need to prove that they own some kind of secret, a secret key. And this whole system was designed to work under the assumption that the attacker basically has full control of the network. They can intercept packets, change them, replay them, reroute them to someone else. They could even eavesdrop on multiple connections at the same time and start retransmitting messages to different parties. So it's a pretty powerful attacker that we're considering, but once you've protected yourself against the powerful attackers, you all immediately gain protection from the less powerful attackers. Another important assumption is the attacker has no direct control over the endpoints. So we're assuming system A is secure, system B is secure, but the connection between them is not secure. And of course, in practice, this is not always the most realistic scenario. Often it's far easier to try to circumvent encryption than actually try to break it. So at the moment, an attacker manages to trick you with a social engineering attack or a scam, or when they manage to place malware in your system, you're no longer protected by this secure channel. And of course, it turned out that in practice, the fact that in a lot of cases, people could be running untrusted JavaScript in their browsers, who could also make all kinds of connections, made setting up the secure channel a lot more difficult. By the way, when anyone has a question during the presentation, you can just raise your hand. So, of course, you could try to solve the problem of setting up a secure channel for web applications by building this into like HTTP or a web protocol. But of course there's many other applications that would also benefit from a secure channel. So what was decided was to basically come up with a protocol that would reside somewhere between OC layers 4 and 5. That would be layered on top of a transport layer protocol such as TCP. Then it would add this security layer to the transport protocol, and then the applications would just interact with this transport layer as if it was just a TCP connection. So this protocol would not, for example, hide the IP address of the person you're talking to, because that exists on a lower layer. If you want to do that, you could use IPsec. You could also, different approaches and different protocols operate, for example, at the application layer. So they already assume that all the lower layers are not trusted, and they apply their cryptography within an application. For example, in the case of PGP, you're using the existing email infrastructure and using client-side applications to encrypt messages. You can also encrypt on a lower layer. For example, in the case of WPA, you want to secure connections between a wireless device and an access point, but in that case you don't really care about the higher layers. So there's different kinds of approaches to transport security, and the idea behind the TLS and the SSL protocol was to basically secure TCP. There's also a variation that could be used for UDP that has some different properties. Called DTLS. That one, for example, allows messages to be reordered or to be dropped. And currently, the people working on the development of the QUIC protocol are also incorporating TLS inside of that reliable transport protocol. So there's sometimes a bit of confusion what the difference is between TLS and SSL. Well, SSL stands for the Secure Sockets Layer. It was named that because it was based on the BSD sockets interface. TLS means Transport Layer Security, and really TLS is simply the successor of SSL. We had SSL versions 2 and 3, and the next version was basically called TLS 1.0. So you could also just there are 6 protocol versions, and halfway through they just changed their name. So that's basically what the difference between SSL and TLS is all about. And sometimes these two names are still used interchangeably. So often when people talk about SSL, they often just mean TLS. Now, when we dive into the protocol itself, TLS basically consists of 3 sub-protocols. You've got a handshake protocol that you start with when you open a connection. This protocol is responsible to make sure that both to negotiate a protocol version and the cryptographic primitives that both parties want to use. At the end, the handshake protocol results into a session key that is shared by both parties but cannot be seen by any attacker intercepting traffic. And during this protocol, a client will be authenticating a server, and optionally the server will also be authenticating the client. So after the handshake protocol is finished, both parties know what cryptography they're going to use, they both have a shared key, and they both know who they're talking to, or at least one party knows who they're talking to. So after the handshake protocol, messages are exchanged using the record protocol. This uses symmetric cryptography instead of asymmetric cryptography and uses the earlier established session key to protect packets. And protecting in this case means encrypting them, authenticating them, but also making sure that packets cannot be replayed or reordered by also authenticating sequence numbers. And finally, there's also the alert protocol, and that's used for notifications and error messages. They could be sent both during the handshake phase and the record phase. When an error occurs before any keys have been negotiated, the alert messages are plainly readable, and after keys have been exchanged, the alert messages become encrypted themselves. So this is what the TLS 1.2 handshake typically looks like. There's also some variations possibly, but this is the most typical scenario. First of all, a client sends a client hello message to a server. This contains information about what this client supports. So the ciphers the client supports, the protocol versions this client supports, and the extensions that this client knows about. Then the server responds to this message by deciding what protocol is going to be used, what ciphers are going to be used, and what extensions are going to be used. Then it provides a certificate, which we'll talk about a little later, and will send this first message that's part of a cryptographic key exchange. So a protocol using asymmetric cryptography to be able to eventually arrive to on a session key. And then it sends a final message that potentially assigns the earlier messages to authenticate itself. Well, that arrives back at the client, then the client does their part of the key exchange protocol, and after both key exchange messages have been exchanged, at that point both parties should know about the session key. So at that point they can start encrypting packets. So the client sends a change cipher spec message to indicate, okay, now we can start encrypting stuff. So from this point on, messages will be encrypted. Finally, the client sends a confirmation message that authenticates the whole handshake to check that nothing has been tampered with. And then the server does the same thing. It also indicates that it can start encrypting now. It will send an encrypted finished message so the client can see whether the message has been encrypted and authenticated correctly and verify whether someone has tampered with the handshake or not. And after this point, both parties can start exchanging encrypted application data. So a really important problem within TLS is how do you actually authenticate someone? How do you know that you're talking to the party you want to talk to and not to some man-in-the-middle attacker or someone who has stolen a domain name or something like that? So the first step in this process is to make sure that Bob in this case owns a secret private key that matches a certain public key that you know about. This can be done in two ways, depending on the protocol version or cipher suites. So either Bob sets a signature on a part of the handshake using his private key, and then Alice can use the public key that she knows to verify that the signature is correct. This signature includes a nonce, a unique value generated by Alice and included in the client hello message. This means, because this value is different every single time, this means that an attacker who sees one signature can't just replay the signature and send it to someone else. It's only useful at one moment during one handshake. Or the alternative approach is to use this public key as part of the key exchange protocol. So this basically means that whenever Bob is secretly using a different private key, or there's an attacker who doesn't know about Bob's key, this will eventually result in both Alice and Bob deriving a different session key. And then when you confirm that both session keys are the same and you see that they don't match, you know that someone must have tampered with the communication, or that someone simply does not own the right private key. Okay, so now you have a method to verify someone's identity if you know the public key, but then you need to know what their public key is. So in order to do this, Bob also presents a certificate. This certificate contains the public key. It contains some information about his identity. On the web, this is a domain name, for example, but it could also be an email address in S-MIME, or with different protocols, different types of identification could be chosen. It also contains information about the certificate validity, for example, an expiration date. After a certain amount of time, this certificate should no longer be accepted. Or it could contain links to servers that can be used to verify the information in the certificate. And it contains a signature on the certificate itself, set by a so-called certificate authority. This certificate authority is a trusted third party that vouches that the information in the certificate is accurate. So at some point, Bob has proven to the certificate authority that the key and his identity belong together, that he is indeed Bob, that he has this public key. And at that point, the certificate authority says, okay, I'm going to sign your certificate now. And I'm going to, for example, check that your expiration date is not too far in the future. And I'm going, and at the moment the signature is set, Bob can start using the certificate. Of course, Alice is not done yet at this point, because now she knows that some CA has vouched for the identity of Bob, but then Alice has to determine whether or not she trusts the CA. So how this works, either the CA has a certificate themselves, a certificate authority certificate, and the protocol can end there, or the CA has a certificate that's signed by another CA. And usually the same certificate authority operates multiple levels of certificates. For example, an intermediate certificate that is valid for a smaller period of time, and a root certificate that's valid for much longer, and that's much harder to, for example, retract. So what Alice does, she verifies all the certificates in the chain. Every certificate needs to be signed by the certificate above it until she finally arrives at a root certificate. And this root certificate should already be known by Alice and should be in Alice's trust source. So she should just know, I already trust this root certificate and the owner of this public key, so whatever is signed by the key owner of this certificate, I trust. Well, what does this root store look like? Alice can of course just choose to not maintain any store of root certificates and just trust everything she gets. At this point, you can still use TLS to have opportunistic encryption. So that means that someone who just passively sniffs the network doesn't know what messages are exchanged. But at the moment you have an active attacker, that active attacker can simply provide their own certificates signed by themselves, and because Alice doesn't have any root CA she trusts, or well, she trusts everything actually, you can always attack this connection. Another approach is to simply have some kind of root certificate hard-coded in the application. This is pretty common with mobile applications. For example, you've got a software vendor or a backend you want to talk to. The software vendor just embeds this certificate in the application. Application only trusts that you're done. And whenever you want to change the certificate, you just push out a new software update. Within a company, you could have a corporate public key infrastructure. In this case, there's going to be some administrator that's responsible for making sure that everybody's trust is up to date and trusts a specific corporate CA. But when you're just a regular end user and you're using a browser, you're probably relying on the worldwide public key infrastructure. And this basically means that there's about 100 different CAs that are already trusted by a browser or your operating system. Their root certificates are stored in your system. And every single one of these CAs can authenticate every single domain name on the entire internet. Of course, you can imagine this can cause a few issues in practice. And with that, we move into the next section, well, the problems and the vulnerabilities that have happened in the past. So, you probably already noticed when I listed the SSL and TLS versions, there was no SSL version 1 in there. The reason for this is that this protocol was never released. This was designed internally by Netscape because there was a lot of demand for well, a secure web. So engineers quickly started working on this. It turned out to not really work very well. At first, there was no authentication, just encryption, so attackers could tamper with the messages being exchanged. And also there was no protection against replays or reordering. So they changed that, but they did authentication with CRC checksums, which are not a cryptographic mechanism and can actually easily be spoofed by an attacker. CRCs are intended to be functionally helpful, so you can see whether a file is changed, but they're not intended to protect against an attacker that's making selective modifications. So the version that did get released already in 1995, so only a few years after the web became publicly available, was SSL version 2. This also had a few issues. For example, it didn't really protect the handshake messages, so a middle attacker could interfere with the handshake to a certain degree and actually downgrade the encryption that both parties wanted to use. So after only a year, Netscape already released the second version called SSL 3. And this one stuck along for a lot longer. Browsers quickly started supporting it. And there were also SSL 3, there were some theoretical issues at the start, but no major vulnerabilities were found for quite a long time. Until they were found. So while designing SSL in the 90s, there was an open question: should we first encrypt packets and then apply integrity protection, or should we first apply authentication or integrity protection and then encryption? At this point, cryptographers didn't really agree which approach was better. It was kind of assumed that both approaches would be valid, so they chose the approach: first we authenticate and then we encrypt. Also, when decryption fails, because, for example, the message was incorrectly padded after you decrypted and you see, oh, the padding is incorrect, then a specific error message called decryption failed would be sent back by a server. But when decryption succeeds, but then after that you do the integrity check fails, then you get a different error message. Well, in 2000, this was not seen as that big of a problem at the start, but in 2002, Voordene discovered an attack that where you could actually look at the type of error message that a server was sending after you've tampered with the message yourself. And based on the type of error message, it reveals a little bit of information about equivalent to one single bit about the original plaintext. So by selectively changing messages and then looking at what kind of error you would get back, you could bit by bit slowly decrypt all communications. And this was actually really practical in a web setting where you can have attackers running untrusted JavaScript on one side, attacking another site that's protected with HTTPS. And of course, when someone visits one unencrypted HTTP site, an attacker can inject that JavaScript in the communication. So in many practical scenarios, whenever you've got an active attacker that's between the client and the server, they can start decrypting stuff. So in TLS 1.0, this issue was, well, not entirely solved at first, but there were no longer different error messages, so it became a lot harder to exploit this attack. Well, there was a different problem. Because TLS 1.0 did not implement the cipher blockchaining mode of operation, which was part of the cryptographic primitive used to protect record messages. It did not entirely implemented correctly, as it should be implemented in order to have the right guarantees. They performed a small optimization that people at first thought was not a really big deal. Eventually, in 2006, a pretty far-fetched and complicated attack was published, where you could actually abuse a single theoretical weakness in the way that SSL was using this mode of operation, but this was not seen to be relevant for HTTPS or many other application protocols. It was kind of known to be an issue and was removed in TLS 1.1, but nobody actually found a way to really exploit that until 2011. And then two researchers published a so-called beast attack, and after searching for a long time, they finally managed to find a way to exploit this theoretical vulnerability and turn it into an actual vulnerability. In order to do that, they did need to abuse a bug in Java and use a Java applet for it. So it was really a pretty complicated and far-fetched attack that could actually be easily patched out. But it did kind of demonstrate that these theoretical vulnerabilities in TLS could potentially lead to actual issues. And it also got a lot of publicity. People started to panic. They thought, oh no, TLS is insecure, what do we do now? People scrambled to start reconfiguring servers or implement new protocols. And after this, looking for TLS vulnerabilities became a popular research subject because these people actually published a practical attack again. That they had a nice demo where they decrypted cookies, so this really kickstarted the field of TLS research. Well, because these two researchers didn't really like that the attack was so convoluted, only worked with Java applets, they started looking further, and 1 year later they actually published a far scarier attack, which they called the crime vulnerability. This attack took advantage of the fact that TLS does not hide the length of messages, it only encrypts them. That's by design. And that also TLS had a useful feature called TLS compression, where it would compress the traffic before encrypting it. And this was really convenient because then you could start saving a lot. You could start saving a lot of space. Protocols that didn't implement compression could be overlaid with it, and this would result in smaller packets. So it was a nice optimization. The problem was that when you actually use this for HTTP, this results in a vulnerability. Because when you compress a message, how well it compresses, how small the message becomes, depends on some information within the message. So for example, if you've got a string AAAA, it will compress a lot stronger because there's a lot of redundancy than when you've got a string of random bits. So there was a theoretical vulnerability, say an attacker can change a part of the message, doesn't know another part of the message. If they change it selectively and look at how well it compresses, eventually maybe they may be able to obtain some secrets. And the same researchers behind Beast actually managed to turn this theoretical vulnerability into an actual, really practical vulnerability where they could simply steal people's cookies in a short amount of time. And this was exploitable with plain JavaScript, didn't require any applets, didn't require any vulnerabilities. Actually, it just required someone to use HTTP over TLS with TLS compression enabled. Luckily, this also was really easy to fix. Just turn off TLS compression and you're no longer vulnerable to this attack. But not all weaknesses in the protocol were introduced by mistake. Some were also introduced intentionally, because in the 90s when SSL was initially designed, it was still illegal to export strong cryptography from the United States. So this caused a bit of a problem for Netscape because they also wanted to have the browser be used abroad. So Netscape created two editions of their browser, the US edition that had strong cryptography and the international edition that did not have strong cryptography. It actually had 40-bit cryptography, which could be cracked by the US government at that time, and nowadays it can just be cracked with anyone with a laptop and a little bit of patience. And this international edition would only support 40-bit ciphers, and the US edition would support the strong ciphers. Of course, when you have operate an American server, you do want to be able to both talk to Europeans and Americans. So what they did, they implemented the cipher negotiation mechanism to make sure that the European browsers would use the weak ciphers and the American browser would use the strong ciphers. And after the whole export restrictions got lifted in 1996, the export cryptography still stuck around because people didn't want to break compatibility. So this resulted in some problems when it comes to downgrade attacks. So the idea behind SSL is that both the client and the server would negotiate the strongest possible option that both would support, but in practice an attacker could actually mess with that and make sure that both parties used a weaker protocol. So a really famous was the Poodle attack, where an attacker would downgrade TLS connections to SSL3 and then do the padding oracle, perform the padding oracle attack I described earlier. And there's also 3 different attacks that actually exploited this export cryptography. And in 2 cases, the client didn't even need to support these outdated export ciphers. Even modern browsers, well, the browsers themselves weren't really vulnerable, but it could be attacked by exploiting the export cryptography that was used by the server. So a lot of servers that still had these things enabled, just for compatibility, actually got into trouble. So even though the export restrictions were lifted in 1996, about 20 years later, people still got attacked as a result of it. Another problem was the implementation of weak cryptography. In SSL v2 there were 5 different options for symmetric ciphers. The first was DES, which was considered to be insecure in the 70s already because the keys were too small. And in 1997, a few years after SSL was released, it actually got cracked publicly. There's RC4, which we already quickly knew had some problems. And then attacks from RC4 started to get stronger and stronger and stronger and more practical. In 2015, you could decrypt an HTTP cookie in about 70 hours. The same happened with ciphers that were technically not broken, but that used a small block size and weren't really suitable for encrypting a large amount of data. This was known, this problem, but not really considered a practical issue until people in 2016 actually managed to exploit this known theoretical vulnerability and started decrypting cookies with the Sweet 32 attack. Of course, it's kind of understandable that the initial ciphers that were included had these problems because SSL actually predates, for example, AES. There wasn't much standardization yet. The internet was still new, attack scenarios were changing. So at the time, the design decisions were actually pretty sound with the knowledge that we had at that time. But over the years, well, cryptographic knowledge started improving and this led to some issues in the long term. And there's also a similar issue with asymmetric RSA encryption I won't get into here. Of course, because TLS is a complicated protocol with lots of features, a lot of extensions, people also start finding a lot of issues within implementation, such as OpenSSL. For example, we had the heartbleed bug, the change cipher spec injection vulnerability. People also started making nice logos for their vulnerabilities to well sell them. There's the famous go-to-fail incident in certificate validation. So yeah, the more complex your protocol, the more likely it is there are going to be bugs. And finally, besides security, there was also a bit of a performance issue with TLS, because when you do a handshake, it would take basically 2 additional round trips before you could start talking to each other. Or when the server starts talking first, it would take 1.5 round trip. And when the protocol is less efficient and not encrypting, then people are more inclined to not encrypt at all. So this negatively affected adoption of TLS. And there were some shortcuts possible, but these actually had some security downsides. So now we get to TLS 1.3. That tries to address many of the issues I mentioned before. So this is a pretty big overhaul of the protocol. The previous protocol updates added small changes, but here they basically changed some of the fundamentals. And the major improvements that were included is that a lot of legacy features that were either unnecessary or potentially dangerous or just added more complexity are all removed. The protocol is simplified, more parts of the handshake are encrypted, and the amount of round trips is reduced to make the protocol more efficient. So, for example, some features that were scrapped were key exchange methods that didn't provide forward secrecy, and forward secrecy means that if someone steals your private key at some point in the future, you can decrypt everything that was sent using that key in the past. So now, even when you do this, you're not able to decrypt messages in the past. They removed complex renegotiation mechanisms that had some vulnerabilities. They gave clients less option to pick custom cryptographic parameters, which could be exploited for certain kinds of attacks and made the handshake more complicated. Yes?
I think some European telecom standards institute is putting those back in their version of TLS 1.3, isn't it?
Well, there was some controversy about this first point, and that really had to do with that the way that you had the LSA key exchange methods or the key transport methods, and some middle boxes that wanted to intercept traffic. Basically, the way they worked, they could conveniently start intercepting a handshake, then store a key, and then later people could just look at the encrypted traffic and start decrypting it. So they actually took advantage of the lack of forward secrecy to more easily be able to sniff encrypted communications. But yeah, this is no longer really possible at TLS 1.3, so there was some controversy about that. I'm not sure about these alternative versions, but in the standard at least, and the way that web browsers are going to implement this is no longer possible. So these people will have to look for other solutions. Yeah?
2 days ago, Etsy did indeed publish their own version of TLS 1.3, which does put us back in the enterprise TLS.
Yeah, enterprise TLS, which is basically weaker TLS. I'm not sure if that's going to succeed very well if the rest of the internet and the browsers are not going to adhere to it. And technically you can still do TLS interception, TLS termination in TLS 1.3. You just have to do a little bit more effort. You have to basically man in the middle every connection, decrypt them, then re-encrypt, and it's maybe going to be a bit less efficient. But it's still possible. So technically they're just weakening the protocol to have some to make these features more efficient. But I doubt it will get very far in practice, because they probably also need to make changes to your browsers. Because I don't think there are any signs of browsers willing to support these alternative protocols at the moment. But we'll see what happens. Oh, and compression was completely removed. This is a list of the cipher suites supported by TLS 1.2 to 1.0. They pruned this down a little bit. Now we've got 5. And all of these 5 is technically, like we have 2 cipher suites that are fast when you have ALS hardware support. We've got one that's fast with software support, and we've got 2 that are fast, that are more efficient to implement on embedded devices. Clear different use cases, and no need to have like the special Japanese or Korean block cipher or all the weak cryptography that we shouldn't be using anymore anyway. Furthermore, after the server hello message has been sent, at that point every part of the handshake message is encrypted, including all certificates. So this is a bit of a minor issue, but now you can no longer look at a server's or a client's certificate information when you're just sniffing the connection. These are also encrypted now, and that can be convenient to improve privacy or to prevent leaking information from client certificates. Well, this is the new handshake. As you can see, there's only one single round trip here. First you have a client hello message, and an important change here is that the client hello message immediately starts sending a client key share, which is the component they use for the key exchange. So the client already does a cryptographic computation right away. And this used to be difficult before because there were many cipher suites and the client wouldn't know what kind of cryptography to perform. Now there's only about 5 different key exchange methods. In practice, most servers will predominantly use 2 of them, and most servers will probably support all 5, so the client can just pick 1 or 2 methods, start already performing their part of the key exchange protocol, and send it right along with the client hello. Then the server does their part of the key exchange methods, then a shared key is already known, they can immediately start encrypting stuff. The whole change cipher spec message was removed because it wasn't really useful. The client and server should both know when to start encrypting things. And when they send back their finished message, the client can send their finished message confirming the handshake, and they can immediately start sending data back and forth.
If you want to send us a client certificate in this,
then that would be contained here if you put it in the handshake.
okay.
So it wouldn't change the number of, well, it does make a difference because the server can directly start sending data after the finished message.
Yeah.
If the server wants to see a client certificate, they can't immediately start sending data, so they have to wait for this message to arrive. Of course, when you're using HTTP, it's the client that starts talking, so it doesn't really matter in practice. But yeah, that's a good question. And you can also send client certificates after the handshake. That feature is still present. So to compare the two handshakes, you can clearly see that the second one is more compact and a little bit less complex potentially than the first. And there's also an additional optimization because after you've performed one single handshake with a server that you know, then you can actually skip all the overheads of the whole handshake at all and do a zero round-trip handshake. Basically, this means that because you exchanged a symmetric key earlier, the client can start sending early data. So they can embed data inside the first client hello message that's encrypted with a key that was negotiated before. So when you go to a web page, you would do the full handshake when loading the main page, and for all the images and scripts and the like that are on that page, we just use this and you have no overhead at all. So the client starts encrypting immediately, and then the server can already send some early data. Then the server can send a response, and the server can already start sending application data after the first finished message. So the first message could contain a HTTP request, the server response could contain a response, and you immediately can start communicating. And that immediately leads into the issues that are still not fixed or that are now introduced. Because when you use a zero round-trip handshake, you create a problem of replay attacks. When you have a client hello message that contains early data, you haven't done the whole exchange yet, so you don't really have any replay protection yet. So the attacker can capture the first client hello and then send it again, so simply repeat it. There are some ways to mitigate this by putting timestamps in the packets or by letting the server cache some client hellos, but those are not always practical to implement. So usually you have a fundamental replay risk on the data of that first packet. So what browsers will probably end up doing is only use the zero round-trip handshake for GET requests and not any like POST requests or state-changing operations. Of course, when you look at how when you're working with HTTP, GET requests should be idempotent, they shouldn't change the state of the server, but in practice sometimes they do, and that could introduce a new type of application vulnerabilities. When you have a GET request that changes something, an attacker could capture the client hello, repeat it a number of times, and when you're doing like a bank transaction, that's not something you want. Another problem are quantum computers. Because once someone has finally made a big quantum computer that can execute Shor's algorithm, they can break RSA, they can break diffie and they can break elliptic curves, which are all the types of asymmetric cryptography that TLS currently relies upon. So this basically means that TLS is broken at this point. So what currently a lot of cryptographers are working on very hard is come up with new types of ciphers that are resistant to quantum computers. There actually are quite a lot of them. There are also some experimental implementations within TLS. The problem is this is still going to take a bit of a while. A post-quantum cryptography competition is going on right now, and it's expected that the first results will arrive around 2022 or 2024. And this can be a bit of a problem because everything you send over TLS right now using the current cryptography can be broken in the future. Even when you passively sniff it, you store it somewhere in 20 years as a quantum computer, you can start decrypting it. So maybe at this moment already, when you have something that should remain confidential for more than 10, 20 years, you may already need to start worrying about this. Well, here we have another problem I talked about before. There are 100 CAs that can authenticate all the whole internet. So when you hack a single one of them, you have broken the internet. And there's a few initiatives to work around this, like certificate transparency, to try to detect these cases. There are also some proposed alternatives for the current global PKA, but none of them really catched on very much. So we still kind of have this problem, which is still a bit of a fundamental problem. But luckily, hopefully nowadays, whenever a CA issues a certificate they should not be able to issue, it gets detected faster, so there's less opportunity for attack. Another typical issue, well, I mentioned before, TLS does not hide the length of messages. So in a situation where you can either send a message yes or no, and you look at the length of the ciphertext, it's pretty easy to distinguish what someone was saying, even though you can't see the contents of the message. And this is also a fundamental issue that's really hard to solve with cryptographic protocols in general. The last problem is interoperability. Upgrading an internet-wide protocol is really hard. Especially when you want to upgrade it in a secure manner. This was also a problem when trying to roll out TLS 1.3. A lot of servers started to break, even though they did use the version negotiation mechanism. There's lots of middle boxes that try to do intelligent things with TLS connections and then break the new protocol. So I'll move on to the next slide, to the last slide. But the point is, upgrading a protocol like this is hard. It's easier on the web because people use browsers that quickly receive updates. But for other applications of TLS, like email, it's a lot more difficult to migrate to the protocol. And that was my phone. Just in time, because this is my final slide. Yes?
It also is a problem for all the Internet of Things things, because they will be in the field for decades to come if left unattended.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And there are already problems with that it's really hard to, like the standard two-party communication mechanism with the whole PKI, can sometimes actually be really cannot really apply always to the Internet of Things. When there's multiple small devices communicating with each other wirelessly, there's not a single server you need to authenticate, but you have multiple devices in your house, for example, that you need to talk with. And there are cryptographic protocols to deal with that, but they're not as well established as TLS, so it's really hard to apply them in practice. And of course, when there's quantum computers and these things are still around in 20 years, well, the protocol is broken. Updating the protocol is also going to be hard. It's already a problem for embedded devices we have right now. This is not a new problem. So yeah, there's still a lot of challenges ahead. So, my conclusions, a lot of lessons were learned for earlier vulnerabilities in SSL and TLS. These lessons were incorporated in TLS 1.3, which is a much simpler, faster and safer protocol, but the general problem of transport security has not been completely solved. And the authors of the TLS standards are aware of this, but there's just some really hard problems for which we don't really have proper solutions just yet. So that was my presentation. Any more questions? Or do we still have time for that? Okay, no questions.